At 30 years old, I've learned the hardest lessons not from school, but from my own family. They pushed me into AI against my will, believing it would make me useful. What they never realized is that I turned that burden into an empire. To them, I was never the daughter with dreams worth listening to. I was the investment, the project, the one they could mold into the family's savior. My father, a man obsessed with being ahead of trends, read one article about artificial intelligence and declared that my entire future would revolve around it. My mother agreed, saying it would guarantee stability for all of us. So they drained every dollar I had saved, birthday money, summer jobs, even the scholarship funds I had earned, and poured it all into online courses and certifications. They called it sacrifice for the greater good, but I called it theft of my youth. I wanted to study art. I wanted to breathe color and creativity into the world. Instead, I was chained to a screen, buried in algorithms, drowning in code I didn't care about. When I cried, they told me tears were weakness. When I resisted, they reminded me of how much money they had spent, how much I owed them. But here's the cruelest twist. I became good at it, not because I loved it, but because I had no other choice. Nights turned into mornings, filled with glowing monitors and stacks of textbooks. I learned faster than my tutors expected. Every line of code that once felt like a cage slowly became a tool I could wield. Still, they never saw me. They only saw what they wanted me to become. When my brother Daniel failed classes, they comforted him, bought him tutors, told him he was special. When I aced exams in computer science, they shrugged and told me that was expected. That pattern defined my childhood. Daniel celebrated for stumbling forward, me ignored for soaring high. My birthdays were postponed, forgotten, or replaced with his achievements. At 16, my party was canceled because he had a soccer game. At 18, they gave me a cheap card 2 days late. At 21, they didn't even remember at all. So, when I returned home for my 30th birthday, I expected very little. Maybe a dinner, maybe a cake. Instead, my mother looked across the table and said, "We canceled your birthday plans. Daniel needs the money for another course." That sting of being second best should have broken me. Instead, it reminded me of how far I had come. Because while they scraped coins together for his fleeting interests, I had already built a company worth millions. The same AI they forced down my throat had become the weapon I now held in silence. Before I continue, don't forget to subscribe, like this video, and comment where you're watching from. If you've ever been overlooked in your own family, this story is for you. And soon, my family will discover the truth. The daughter they controlled now controls everything. From the outside, my childhood probably looked ordinary. A modest house in a quiet neighborhood, 2 parents who claimed to care, and a brother who always seemed to shine brighter than me. But the truth of my childhood was written in the quiet dismissals, the forgotten celebrations, and the relentless pressure to become what my family wanted, not who I was meant to be. It started small. My parents would beam with pride when Daniel managed to kick a ball across the yard, while my perfect spelling test was tucked into a drawer without mention. They would attend his school plays with flowers and applause, while my science fair projects were glanced at quickly before they rushed off to his next event. I wasn't invisible. Not exactly. I was useful. That was the role assigned to me. The moment my father read that article about artificial intelligence, everything changed. He became obsessed with the idea that AI was the future, and he declared that I was the one who would carry the family forward. It didn't matter that I was just a teenager with dreams of painting, with a sketchbook hidden under my mattress full of colors and shapes that brought me peace. My father tore through my savings and signed me up for online courses I had never asked for. My mother stood beside him, calling it an investment. Suddenly, my life wasn't mine anymore. Weekends that should have been filled with laughter, friends, and quiet joy were stolen by endless assignments in programming and mathematics. Summer vacations became long hours locked in my room, staring at screens filled with code that felt like chains. I remember nights when I sat in the dark after everyone had gone to bed, my head pressed against my desk, tears staining my notebook. But no one ever noticed. If I resisted, my parents reminded me of how much they had spent. They reminded me that family came first. They reminded me that I owed them everything. And when I complained about wanting art lessons instead of algorithms, my father's eyes hardened, and he told me I would thank him one day. Daniel, meanwhile, floated through life without pressure. Every mistake he made was forgiven. Every failure was softened with comfort. When he dropped out of one activity, they eagerly signed him up for another. When I excelled, it was treated as expected, as if success was simply my duty. My mother would pat my shoulder and say, "That's what happens when you work hard," before rushing off to brag about Daniel's latest talent. By 16, the contrast between us was unbearable. My 16th birthday, a milestone in any teenager's life, was erased by his soccer tournament. I sat alone that night with a small store-bought cupcake I had purchased myself. I lit the candle, made a wish I knew would never come true, and blew it out in silence. No one even noticed. No. At 18, when most of my classmates were celebrating their freedom, my parents drained what little college fund I had left to send me to another AI boot camp. They called it a gift, but I knew it was a prison. I spent that summer buried in concepts I hated, watching friends travel, laugh, and live, while I memorized machine learning models I didn't even understand at the time. But here's the truth I could only see in hindsight. Every hour I spent chained to that desk was sharpening me. I hated it, but I learned it. I despised it, but I absorbed it. And slowly, without realizing, I became fluent in the very language my family had forced upon me. Still, the sacrifices piled up like stones on my chest. I worked weekends at a bookstore just to afford basic things my parents refused to buy for me, because all the money was tied up in the family's future, meaning Daniel's dreams or my AI courses. I walked past art stores with canvases and paints I couldn't afford, each one a reminder of what I had lost. College should have been a turning point, but instead, it was another reminder of inequality. Daniel received every ounce of support when he wanted to study abroad for a semester, while I was told to manage with the cheapest program and continue my AI path. I remember crying in the library bathroom, clutching my scholarship acceptance letter, knowing I should feel proud but instead feeling hollow. The weight of sacrifice wasn't just in what I was forced to do. It was in what I was forced to abandon. Friendships that faded because I was always too busy. Dreams that rotted in sketchbooks left unopened. Birthdays that passed without recognition. A childhood stolen piece by piece until all that was left was the obedient daughter carrying the burden of everyone else's hopes. But there was one thing my family never accounted for. Silence can forge steel. They thought they were controlling me, but in reality, they were training me. Every dismissal, every forgotten birthday, every forced lesson was fuel. It burned inside me, turning resentment into determination. By my early 20s, while Daniel drifted between failed projects and half-hearted jobs, I had already mastered the tools they had shoved into my hands. And though I still resented them for forcing me into AI, I began to realize something powerful. They had given me the keys to a kingdom they would never enter. The irony was almost unbearable. The same parents who used family as a weapon to strip me of choice had unknowingly built the foundation of my independence. The same sacrifices they demanded became the stones I used to build walls between their expectations and my future. And though I hadn't yet revealed it, the empire I was quietly constructing was growing. While they thought I was still their obedient daughter, I was already becoming someone they could no longer control. They believed they had sacrificed me for family, but what they really did was create the one person who would no longer sacrifice for them. By the time I reached my early 20s, the cracks in my family's perfect image were no longer hairline fractures. They were deep, visible scars. The truth was that my parents had built their lives on shaky ground, spending money they didn't have and justifying every reckless choice as an investment in the future. And yet, whenever the bills piled up or the debts grew too heavy to carry, their solution was the same: place the weight squarely on my shoulders. I had always been the reliable one. I was the daughter who didn't ask for much, who could be trusted to endure disappointment without complaint. Daniel, on the other hand, was the dreamer, the golden child who seemed to float above consequences. His failures were seen as stepping stones, his indulgences as deserved luxuries. When he quit a job after only a few months, my parents praised his bravery for not settling. When I worked long hours at part-time jobs while juggling AI courses I never wanted, they called it responsibility, as if endurance were the only quality I was meant to embody. It was during those years that the financial cracks widened into chasms. My parents had borrowed against their retirement savings to pay for Daniel's new car, justifying it as necessary for his career prospects. They refinanced the house to cover his latest enrollment in an expensive international program he dropped out of within weeks. Each time, the debts climbed higher, and each time I was reminded that my skills in AI would one day rescue them all. The irony cut deep. They had forced me into this path, robbed me of my own choices, and now treated me as a lifeline they had engineered. My father would remind me that the family's sacrifices had been for me, as if the stolen savings and missed birthdays were gifts I should be grateful for. My mother would nod in agreement, repeating the same refrain: family comes first. But what she really meant was, your life comes second. I carried that truth everywhere I went. Each forgotten holiday and canceled celebration pressed on me like a weight. I began to feel less like a daughter and more like collateral for their mistakes. They gambled recklessly with their finances, believing that one day I would pay the bill with whatever career they had forced me into. I was not a person to them. I was insurance. The more their world unraveled, the more they tightened their grip on me. When Daniel failed again, their eyes turned to me for stability. When their credit cards maxed out, they justified it by reminding me that one day I would be earning enough to cover everything. Even my smallest successes were never truly mine. They were seen as family victories, while my struggles were treated as personal shortcomings. I remember vividly one evening when I overheard them talking in the kitchen, unaware that I was listening. My father's voice was tight with frustration, lamenting that they had poured so much into Daniel with so little return. My mother reassured him, reminding him that I was the responsible one, that I would make everything right. It was as if I were not a human being, but a solution waiting to be activated. Hearing those words solidified something inside me. I realized they would never see me for who I was, only for what I could provide. The pressure began to suffocate me. My 20s should have been a time of exploration, of finding out who I was, but instead, they were spent trapped in obligations I never chose. I woke up every morning with the knowledge that my family's failures had become my chains. And yet, with every passing day, a quiet rebellion was forming. While they wasted money and opportunities, I was learning to build something that was mine. At first, I told myself it was just survival, a way to escape their grasp. But slowly, it became more. Every debt they piled onto me became motivation. Every dismissal of my worth became fuel. I began to study AI not as their obedient daughter, but as a strategist preparing for battle. I wasn't learning for them anymore. I was learning for me. Still, the resentment grew. The image of Daniel living freely while I shouldered the invisible weight haunted me. He traveled while I saved. He dreamed while I built. He failed while I endured. My parents never noticed the imbalance because they didn't want to. It was easier to believe their narrative, that Daniel was brilliant but misunderstood, and that I was dependable enough to make their sacrifices worthwhile. The cracks in their finances, their favoritism, and their logic were glaring, but they refused to see them. Instead, they patched over reality with borrowed money and hollow words. I watched silently as their foundation crumbled, waiting for the moment when their illusions would finally collapse. Because I knew something they didn't. I had stopped being their investment a long time ago. I was no longer the obedient daughter carrying their debts like a burden. I was turning into something else, someone who could stand alone, powerful enough to never need them again. And one day, those cracks in the family they ignored would split wide open, forcing them to see the truth they had buried for years. I was the only one who could save them. But when that day came, I wasn't sure I would want to. For years, I carried resentment like a second skin. Every algorithm I memorized felt like another chain. Every lecture I endured seemed like a reminder of what I had lost. But somewhere in the stillness of those long nights, something began to shift. The more I resisted the world they forced upon me, the more I realized that resistance itself was sharpening me. I began to see patterns where others saw confusion. What had once felt like meaningless strings of numbers became puzzles I could solve. The same lessons I had once despised turned into skills that gave me control over systems larger than myself. I never admitted it to anyone, not even to myself at first. But I was mastering the very thing they thought had broken me. I didn't learn with joy. I learned with quiet rage. Every keystroke carried the memory of a forgotten birthday. Every project completed was powered by the bitterness of canceled celebrations. I buried my anger in lines of code, and the strange thing was, the code always obeyed. While my family saw me as their reluctant investment, I was secretly building a foundation that would one day free me from them completely. Still, I kept it hidden. To them, I was simply obedient. They believed I was doing exactly what they had demanded, following their vision, preparing to pay back the family debt. But behind closed doors, my studies became something else entirely. I was no longer just consuming information. I was experimenting, creating, testing limits. I spent nights building small models and tools that no one asked me to build. I didn't show them. I didn't brag. I kept my victories in silence. That silence became my sanctuary. It was the only place where I felt in control. In those moments, I wasn't the neglected daughter or the forgotten birthday girl. I wasn't the responsible one, carrying debts that weren't mine. I was someone new. Someone who could command machines, who could bend systems to my will, who could imagine a future untouched by their control. But silence is heavy. I carried the knowledge of my growing abilities, while they carried on with their reckless lives. They celebrated Daniel's brief successes and ignored his many failures, all while expecting me to remain their safety net. They didn't realize that I was no longer preparing to save them. I was preparing to leave them behind. I think part of me wanted to fail, just to spite them. I wanted to abandon the path they had forced upon me. But the truth is, I couldn't. The deeper I went, the more I realized that mastery itself was power. And power was something I had been denied my entire life. I wasn't going to give it up, not even out of spite. So I studied harder than ever. I volunteered for extra projects, took freelance coding jobs, and consumed every resource I could find. I lived like a ghost, invisible to the world outside, but inside, I was transforming. While Daniel traveled, partied, and drifted, I was building. While my parents clung to illusions, I was carving a future they could never take credit for. The irony was cruel. The same prison they built for me became my weapon. They had forced me into AI to serve their vision, but in silence, I was rewriting that destiny into my own. Each new concept mastered was another brick in the wall between us. Each success I kept to myself was another secret they would never understand. I didn't dream of recognition anymore. I stopped hoping they would see me. Instead, I dreamed of escape. I imagined walking away with nothing but the skills they had forced upon me, using those very skills to build a life where their voices couldn't reach. That dream kept me alive through the exhaustion, through the resentment, through the loneliness. By the time most of my peers were just beginning to figure out who they were, I had already built the skeleton of something far greater. Quietly, invisibly, I was becoming someone dangerous. Not dangerous in the way of violence or rebellion, but dangerous because I no longer needed anyone. My family still saw me as their obedient daughter, their safety net, their sacrifice. But in the silence they ignored, I had mastered their weapon. And one day, they would realize the truth. I was never theirs to control. I was mine all along. Some victories don't come with applause. They happen in silence, long after everyone else has gone to bed, when the only witness is the dull glow of a computer screen. That was how my first real breakthrough arrived, not in celebration, but in the stillness of a night I thought would be like any other. For years, I had been forced into studying AI as if it were a punishment. Algorithms had felt like chains, and every line of code carried the bitterness of lost dreams. But in the quiet hours of one summer, something inside me shifted. I wasn't just memorizing material anymore. I was experimenting, testing, and building something that was mine. It started with a small idea I had found in an online forum, a challenge to create a model that could adapt to different writing styles. Most treated it as theoretical, but I felt drawn to it, maybe because I knew what it meant to adapt, to bend myself into shapes my family demanded. Maybe because, for once, I wanted to build something for me, not for them. Weeks passed in a blur. I skipped meals, I ignored sleep, and I poured every ounce of myself into that code. My parents thought I was doing another course assignment. Daniel never even asked. Alone in my room, I wrote and rewrote until the code no longer felt foreign. It felt like a language only I could speak. And then, one night, it worked. The program didn't just copy patterns. It adapted, shifting and responding with a kind of intelligence that felt alive. I stared at the screen, breathless. For the first time, I wasn't proud because I had fulfilled their demands. I was proud because I had created something extraordinary on my own terms. I didn't tell my family. I knew they would twist it into their story, claiming my success as proof of their sacrifices. So I kept it quiet. Instead, I uploaded the project online, curious if anyone beyond the walls of my house would even notice. To my surprise, they did. Comments began to appear. Strangers praised my innovation. Developers reached out to test the model. A small blog even featured my work, calling it a glimpse of the future. For the first time in my life, recognition came from people who didn't owe me anything, who had no reason to flatter me. It was real, and it was mine. That validation lit a fire inside me. I had spent years believing I was invisible, the forgotten child, the investment no one respected. Yet here I was, building something that strangers saw value in, something that could outlast the neglect that shaped me. My pain had transformed into power, and I wasn't going to let it go. The project opened doors I never expected. A small startup reached out, offering to pay me to integrate the model into their platform. The money wasn't much, but it was the first paycheck I earned that didn't pass through my family's control. I hid it away, adding it to secret savings that became my quiet rebellion. While my family celebrated Daniel's every minor achievement, I kept building. They still thought I was their obedient daughter, dutifully completing courses for their imagined future. In reality, I was laying the foundation of my independence. Looking back, I realized that breakthrough wasn't just technical, it was personal. It was the moment I understood that my family's control no longer defined me. I didn't need their approval. I didn't even need their recognition. All I needed was the work, the skills, and the determination to turn chains into stepping stones. That night, sitting in the dim light of my room, I smiled to myself. My family thought they had sacrificed me for their dreams, but what they had really done was arm me with the tools to escape them forever. And though I stayed silent, I knew this was only the beginning. By the time my project had spread quietly through online communities, I realized I had stumbled onto something more than a late-night experiment. What I had built wasn't just code, it was a foundation. And if I nurtured it, it could become the key to a life where my family no longer dictated who I was or what I owed. I didn't celebrate openly. Outwardly, nothing changed. To my family, I was still the daughter buried in endless AI courses they had forced on me. I still sat at the kitchen table with my laptop, still listened to my mother remind me of how much they had invested in my future, still watched as Daniel drifted through another failed idea without consequence. But inside, everything was shifting. The startup didn't begin with investors, or office space, or even a name. It began in silence, with me. I started freelancing under an alias, taking small contracts from companies who wanted to test adaptive models. The money was modest at first, but it was mine, and that alone made it priceless. I created hidden accounts to store what I earned, watching as the balance grew dollar by dollar into a secret my family could never touch. At night, I refined my program, pushing it beyond writing styles and into education, healthcare, even business analysis. Each adaptation opened new doors, new possibilities. I worked quietly, methodically, while my parents remained blind to the empire forming under their roof. They still treated me like an investment waiting to mature, never realizing that I had already built something far beyond their imagination. Meanwhile, their lives unraveled further. My parents' debts multiplied. Daniel jumped from one expensive idea to the next, each failure patched by money they didn't have. They clung to the belief that one day I would rescue them, that the sacrifices they claimed to have made for me would finally pay off. I let them believe it. I kept my head down, nodding when they reminded me of how much they had spent, pretending to carry their vision, while in truth, I was carrying my own. The duality was exhausting. By day, I was the obedient daughter. By night, I was a builder. My bedroom, once a place of resentment, became a workshop of quiet power. Cables, notebooks, and empty coffee cups piled around me as I lost myself in the rhythm of creation. I wasn't just coding anymore. I was planning. I was designing a future that belonged only to me. The turning point came when an angel investor, impressed by my online work, reached out with an offer. It wasn't millions. It wasn't life-changing on its own. But it was validation that I could grow this beyond freelancing, that my hidden empire could become real. I accepted quietly, using the funds to upgrade my equipment, expand my models, and bring in a handful of collaborators who never even knew my real name. Secrecy was my shield. I didn't dare tell my family. I imagined the smugness on my father's face, the way he would twist my progress into proof of his foresight, the way my mother would claim it all as the fruit of her sacrifices. I couldn't allow them to own what I had built. So I stayed silent, guarding my empire like a secret flame. Every contract I signed, every new feature I developed, every email I sent under that alias brought me closer to freedom. The money wasn't just numbers in an account. It was escape. It was the first step toward breaking the chains that had bound me for so long. And yet, even as I grew stronger, my family grew weaker. Their debts deepened, their arguments became louder, and Daniel's failures piled higher. They didn't see the cracks in their own foundation because they were too busy waiting for me to save them. but I had stopped planning to save them. I was building to save myself. The empire was still small, still fragile, but it was real, and I knew one day it would be undeniable. When that moment came, my family would see the truth they had buried for years. The daughter they forced into AI had quietly become the architect of her own destiny. And by then, it would be too late for them to claim it as theirs. The empire I was building in silence grew stronger with every passing month, while the world my family clung to began to unravel. At first, the cracks in their lives seemed small, an overdue bill here, a collection notice there. But soon those cracks widened into canyons too deep to ignore. Debt collectors started calling the house. Letters marked final notice arrived in the mail and were shoved hastily into drawers. I would hear my parents whispering late at night, their voices strained with fear, while Daniel continued to live as if nothing had changed. He drifted from one failed business idea to another, borrowing money he could never repay, always convinced the next venture would make him rich. My parents enabled him every time, pouring what little they had into his whims, desperate to believe he was still their golden child. But no amount of denial could hide the truth forever. The mortgage payments were falling behind. Credit cards had reached their limits. Even the car Daniel drove, the one they had financed in his name, was on the verge of repossession. Our home, once filled with the illusion of stability, felt like it was collapsing under the weight of their mistakes. Through it all, I remained silent. I listened as they argued, as blame shifted from one to another, as the reality of their downfall closed in. And every time, their eyes eventually turned toward me. They didn't say it directly, but I could feel the weight of their expectations pressing against me like a hand on my throat. I was the one who was supposed to fix everything. I was the responsible one. I was the daughter who had been forced into AI for the sake of the family's future. Surely, they thought, it was finally time for me to pay it back. The irony was suffocating. For years, they had neglected me, ignored my dreams, and treated me as little more than insurance. Now, when the walls were caving in, they expected that insurance policy to cash out. But I wasn't the same daughter they thought they had molded. I wasn't their safety net anymore. While their world collapsed, mine was expanding. My project had grown into contracts that paid more than I had ever imagined possible. Investors were circling, intrigued by the adaptability of my models. I upgraded my hidden workspace, improved my infrastructure, and secured partnerships with people who had no idea that behind the alias was a woman who had been written off by her own family. I was thriving in the shadows while they drowned in the spotlight of their own poor choices. I felt a strange mix of emotions watching it all unfold. Part of me ached at the sight of my mother's tired eyes, at the sound of my father's voice cracking under the strain of bills he couldn't pay. But another part of me, the part forged from years of neglect and forced sacrifice, felt cold. They had created this reality. They had gambled everything on Daniel's failures, and they had built their safety net out of me without ever asking if I wanted to carry it. Now, they were falling, and I wasn't sure I wanted to catch them. Their downfall only deepened the contrast between us. While they scrambled to make ends meet, I quietly paid off debts of my own, student loans, bills they had once promised to cover, but never did. I watched as the financial freedom I had earned in silence became my armor, while they stood exposed and vulnerable. The shift in power was undeniable. For the first time, I wasn't the one suffocating under their demands. They were suffocating under the consequences of their own choices. And deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time before they would come to me openly, no longer with commands or expectations, but with desperation. The collapse of their world wasn't just financial, it was emotional too. The pedestal Daniel had lived on all his life was beginning to crack. His failures were too obvious, too costly to ignore anymore. My parents, once blind with pride, now looked at him with thinly veiled disappointment. Yet even then, they clung to hope, insisting he just needed one more chance. I stayed quiet. I let them believe whatever lies kept them afloat. But inside, I was preparing for the moment when their collapse would bring them to my door. Because I knew it was coming. The same family that had forced me into a future I never asked for was about to beg for a place in the empire I had built from the ruins they left me. And when that moment arrived, everything would change. The collapse of my family's world reached its breaking point one evening when the silence in our kitchen felt heavier than the debts stacked around them. Bills littered the table. My father's hands trembled as he flipped through statements, and my mother's tired eyes avoided mine. Daniel slouched in his chair, pretending not to notice the storm brewing, though he was at the center of it all. For years, I had carried their expectations quietly, suffocating under the weight of their demands. But in that moment, something shifted. I was no longer the silent daughter who absorbed their choices without question. I was no longer the girl they had forced into AI as if my dreams didn't matter. I was a woman who had turned chains into weapons, someone who had quietly built an empire while they weren't watching. It started with a slip. My father muttered about needing another loan, his voice hoarse with desperation. My mother whispered that maybe I could help just a little until Daniel's plans worked out. I felt the familiar sting of resentment, but instead of swallowing it, I let the truth slip past my lips. I told them they didn't need another loan. What they needed was stability, the kind I had already built for myself. The words hung in the air like a crack of thunder. My parents looked at me with confusion, Daniel with disbelief. For the first time in years, their attention wasn't on his failures or their debts. It was on me. They asked what I meant, their voices wavering between hope and suspicion. And I realized, right then, that I was done hiding. I revealed pieces of my life they had never imagined. The projects I had built in silence, the contracts I had signed under an alias, the recognition I had gained outside these walls. I didn't boast or shout. I simply spoke the truth, steady and calm, as if I had been waiting my whole life to be heard. At first, their faces were blank. My mother blinked as though she hadn't understood. My father's mouth fell open, his eyes narrowing in disbelief. Daniel laughed nervously, dismissing my words as exaggeration. But when I explained the scope of what I had built, when I described the companies using my models and the investors backing my vision, their laughter and confusion turned into silence. For years, they had seen me as a tool, a sacrifice, the reliable daughter who would one day repay them. They had never considered the possibility that I had already risen beyond their reach. Now, confronted with the reality they had ignored, they looked at me as if I were a stranger. The irony was almost painful. They had forced me into this path, convinced it would serve their dreams. Yet now, those same choices had created someone they no longer recognized, someone they could no longer control. In that silence, I felt something I had never felt before: power. Not the kind that comes from money or recognition, but the kind that comes from finally being seen. For the first time, they couldn't dismiss me. They couldn't brush aside my achievements or diminish my worth. The truth was too large to ignore, but I didn't stop there. I told them plainly that I had no intention of being their safety net, that the empire I had built wasn't theirs to claim. I had worked in silence, not for them, but for myself. And though I could choose to help them, it would be on my terms, not theirs. The room grew colder. My mother's eyes filled with tears. My father's hands shook, and Daniel's smirk faded into something closer to fear. They had spent years believing they held control over me, but in that moment, the roles were reversed. I wasn't their obedient daughter anymore. I was the one holding all the power. And for the first time in my life, I let them see it. The silence that followed my revelation was unlike any I had ever experienced in that house. It wasn't the silence of neglect, or of being ignored, or of words left unsaid. It was the silence of realization, heavy and undeniable. For the first time, my family truly saw me, not as the obedient daughter they had molded, not as the insurance policy they had invested in, but as someone far beyond their control. At first, they resisted the truth. My father tried to minimize it, saying success in technology was unstable, reminding me that fortunes could disappear overnight. My mother clung to disbelief, repeating that she couldn't understand how I had kept this from them. Daniel laughed bitterly, suggesting I must be exaggerating. But underneath their words was something stronger than denial: fear. They knew deep down that I was no longer the one who needed them. They were the ones who needed me. The shift was almost immediate. My father's questions turned practical, his voice less commanding than pleading. He wanted to know if I could help with the mortgage, if I could temporarily take over some of the bills. My mother's tone softened in ways I had never heard before, asking if I might offer Daniel a position in my company, even something small, just until he found his footing. Daniel, who had spent his life basking in their favoritism, looked at me with desperation thinly disguised as arrogance, insisting that he could be useful if I gave him a chance. It was surreal. For years, I had been invisible, pushed aside, dismissed. Now, the same voices that once commanded me were begging. The same people who told me I owed them were asking what they could do to earn a place in my world. The power dynamic had flipped completely, and they knew it. I should have felt triumphant. And in a way, I did. There was satisfaction in watching them confront the reality they had tried to deny, in seeing them realize that the daughter they overlooked had surpassed them all. But there was also something heavier: the weight of choice. For the first time, I wasn't powerless. My decisions would shape not just my future, but theirs. Part of me wanted to turn away, to let them feel the same abandonment I had felt, to remind them of every forgotten birthday, every sacrifice they forced on me, every time they had made me feel small. A cruel justice whispered inside me, tempting me to let them fall, to prove that I didn't need them and never would. But another part of me hesitated, because beneath the pride, beneath the satisfaction, was the truth. They were still my family, flawed, selfish, blind to my worth for most of my life, but mine nonetheless. That truth was harder to ignore than any debt notice or desperate plea. So I didn't give them an answer right away. I let the silence linger, forcing them to sit with the weight of their own mistakes. For once, they had to feel what it was like to wait for me, to hope for my approval, to live in uncertainty. And in that moment, I realized just how much power I held. The daughter they had forced into AI, the one they had treated as their safety net, now stood as the gatekeeper of their survival. Every decision I made from that point forward would be mine alone, not theirs. And while they begged for a place in my world, I understood something I had never believed possible. I didn't need them anymore. The power had shifted, and this time, it wasn't going back. I never imagined that the day would come when the roles would be reversed so completely. For most of my life, I had been the silent one, the overlooked daughter, the one who was always expected to sacrifice without hesitation. My family took my presence for granted and dismissed my pain as though it were a small inconvenience. They told me I owed them everything. They drained my savings for courses I didn't ask for, and they forced me down a path I never chose. I was their safety net, their insurance, their last resort. But now, standing in front of them, the weight of truth filling the air like thunder before a storm, it was clear that the balance had shifted forever. The silence in the room was unlike anything I had known before. It wasn't the silence of being ignored, or the silence of sitting alone on forgotten birthdays. This silence was heavier, filled with fear, shame, and realization. My father's hands trembled as he tried to fold the bills scattered on the table, as if hiding them could erase the truth of their collapse. My mother's eyes were wet with tears, her lips pressed tight as if words might shatter the fragile air between us. Daniel, who had always been the golden child, sat slouched in his chair, his face pale, his usual arrogance stripped away. For the first time, they were no longer in control. For the first time, they were waiting for me. I could feel every memory rising inside me, demanding to be spoken aloud. The night of my 16th birthday, when I bought myself a single cupcake with my meager bookstore paycheck because no one had remembered. The summer when my college fund disappeared into yet another one of Daniel's whims while I was forced into another AI course I didn't want. The sting of every time my achievements were brushed aside with the casual remark that hard work was expected of me, while Daniel's smallest victories earned dinners, applause, and celebration. All of it came back, layer after layer, reminding me of the person I had been and the person I had become. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. My voice was calm when I finally spoke, but every word carried the weight of years. I told them I remembered everything. I told them how I had carried their choices like chains, how I had endured their neglect while building quietly in the dark. And then I told them what they had refused to see, that the empire they believed they were forcing me to create for them was already mine, that I had grown beyond them, beyond their reach, beyond their control. Their faces said everything: shock, disbelief, shame. My father opened his mouth as if to argue, but no words came out. My mother let out a small sob, her tears finally falling. Daniel shook his head, half in denial, half in fear. But none of them could escape the truth. For the first time, they saw me as I truly was. And then, I gave them my verdict. I told them I would not abandon them, but I would not save them the way they wanted either. They had dreamed of living off my success, of twisting my achievements into proof of their sacrifices. They imagined that I owed them a life of comfort because they had once forced me into endless lessons. But they were wrong. If they wanted stability now, they would have to earn it. I told my father that with his background in numbers, he could take an administrative role in my company, under the authority of managers decades younger than him, learning humility one spreadsheet at a time. I told my mother that if she wanted to help, she could start by organizing small schedules, tasks so simple she would understand what it meant to follow instead of dictate. And Daniel, the brother who had lived a life without accountability, would begin at the bottom. No shortcuts, no favoritism, no safety net. He would have to prove himself, not to me as his sister, but to the very empire he once believed was his by birthright. The silence deepened. My father's eyes lowered, the authority gone from his posture. My mother covered her mouth, ashamed and humbled. Daniel looked at me with a mix of anger and desperation, realizing that for the first time, his future depended on someone other than himself, and that someone was me. It should have felt like revenge, and part of it did. There was a quiet satisfaction in watching the pedestal they had built for Daniel crumble beneath him, in seeing the pride fall from my father's face, in witnessing the tears of the woman who had told me over and over again that family came first, even if that meant I always came last. But more than revenge, what I felt was closure. For the first time, I wasn't their burden, their obligation, their forgotten daughter. I was their future, and I was the one holding all the power. When I walked out of that house that night, I knew nothing would ever be the same. My empire would continue to grow, and they would either learn to adapt to my terms or be left behind. I had become the architect of my own destiny, and they were no longer authors in my story. And now, I want to turn to you. Because if you've listened to my story this far, if you've felt the pain of being invisible, of being overlooked, of being forced into a role you never chose, then you understand why this story matters. But I need you to do something for me right now. Don't just watch. Don't just listen in silence. Take action. Please, subscribe to this channel. Hit the like button. Leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. I'm not asking casually. I'm asking with everything I have. Because every subscription, every like, every comment is what allows me to keep telling stories like this. Stories about resilience, about transformation, about turning pain into power. If you've ever felt small, if you've ever been told you weren't enough, then subscribing is more than just clicking a button. It's standing with me. It's saying, my story matters too. So I'm begging you. Yes, begging. Click that button right now. Do it because you know how it feels to be underestimated. Do it because you want to be part of something bigger than just one story. Do it because each new subscriber is proof that silence doesn't win, that pain can be transformed into strength, that voices like ours will not fade. Don't wait. Don't think about it. Don't assume someone else will. Let this be your moment. Subscribe now. Smash that like button. Leave a comment. Be part of this journey. Because together, we can keep building stories that inspire, stories that reveal hidden strength, stories that remind us all that we are not alone. So please, I'm asking from the bottom of my heart, subscribe, like, comment, do it now. Join me, and let's turn struggles into victories, silence into power, and forgotten voices into stories the world can no longer ignore.